For more on these social media bans, let's speak to Nicholas Cara, Director of the Centre for Digital Cultures and Societies at the University of Queensland. Thank you so much for making the time to speak with us today, Nicholas. So in Australia, 5 social media giants, they're being investigated over a social media ban breach for about 4 months after that law came into force. Does this come as a surprise?
I don't think it comes as a surprise to people who've been watching events in Australia over the last several months. So I think when the government introduced this ban in December last year, the platforms, interestingly, went ahead and complied with the ban. But I guess the question now the government is asking is, did the measures they take to prevent children from accessing social media actually comply in a sense that they don't allow for systematic breaches? And I suppose what the regulator is now investigating is whether, in effect, many or most under 16-year-olds who've wanted to have been able to get around whatever control those platforms have put in place.
So is this really an issue of compliance, or is this a technical fault?
I think that's what is being debated now, because the regulator said to platforms, you can use a variety of age assurance technologies to prevent under 16s from accessing your platforms. And then, whether those age assurance technologies are fit for purpose, I suppose now is a matter for debate between the regulators and the platforms. So whatever tools and techniques the platforms were using, like, for example, asking young people to scan their face and use age estimation technology, on the basis of a face scan to work out if they're over 16 or under 16, is that technology effective enough? Or if a young person has created an account, had their face scanned and been told they're under 16, but then, quickly created another account and, say, got an older friend to scan their face instead, are those techniques then too easy for young people to get around? And should the platforms be taking more responsibility for making sure whatever techniques they're using are kind of watertight enough to ban young people? So I think, in a way, this is now where things get interesting, because the platforms have been told that they need to take reasonable steps to make sure there aren't systematic breaches of the rules. And now that, it's obvious that tens of thousands of young people are able to get around the rules, well, who is responsible for that? And that's the interesting question now, that's going to have to be worked out between the regulator and the platforms.
Let's face it, young people, they're very tech savvy. And this report underlined that children are finding ways to get around the age checks. Won't this keep happening with a blanket ban like this?
I think that's what experts in Australia who have been working with young people around social media for several decades now were saying all along, that whatever techniques you brought in to guess effectively the age of young people, that one thing we've learned from watching 2 decades of millennials and Generation Z using digital media is they are unbelievably creative. These platforms are really central to their identities and social networks. So they're really motivated to stay connected because it's how they stay connected to their friends. And so it shouldn't be surprising to any of us that young people are really motivated and clever when it comes to getting around these kinds of controls. And I think many experts are kind of saying, well, like, what at the end of the day, how far are you going to force platforms to go to force young people off these platforms?
We're about 4 months into Australia's ban. What kind of impact are we seeing among young people? Has this been as effective as authorities had hoped?
I think a ban like this is something where, it's a little bit like when we began to bring in restrictions on smoking in many countries a generation ago, that it actually takes a long time to see what the effect of those restrictions actually are. The effect of a ban like this might be felt more substantially over time because, at the moment we're dealing with a generation of young people who have been on social media, and now in a sense we're trying to force them off it. And the ban might turn out to be effective in the long term because it might delay young people from getting on social media altogether. And so it might be several years down the track before we actually see the effect of it. And these years here in the middle, where we're caught with a generation who are on social media and we're trying to force them off, are not, in a sense, the best measure of what the long-term impact will be. And I think on those larger questions about young people's well-being, we're going to have to wait a long time, I think, to work out whether moving young people on social media, increased their well-being or decreased it. What I think we do know is it's going to substantially change the way they socialise with one another, and that's going to have benefits to young people, but it's going to have really significant consequences to other young people because they're going to experience it as such a significant disruption to their social lives. So I think it's just simply too early to say whether, what the effects of this have been on young Australians.
Nicholas, I want to turn to the U.S., where a recent landmark trial against Meta and Google found them both liable for social media addiction. What are the implications of this for social media firms, and could this open more companies to lawsuits over users' well-being?
Well, around the world, there are very different legal systems in each country. So what may work in a court in America might not work in a court in another country in the world. So I don't think it's always straightforward to transfer these sorts of things from one legal system to another. I think what's kind of interesting here in Australia is just in the last week or two, the government has refined the definition of social media under this legislation. Not just to sort of name particular platforms as social media platforms, but to say that the ban should apply to any platform that is using algorithmic recommendation of content to young people, that this is the specific harm they're trying to regulate for. And so that is kind of closely aligned, if you like, with the findings in the court in America last week, which were about the question of algorithmic recommendation. And what's interesting about this is that social media platforms now for a couple of decades have said, we're not responsible for harms to young people because we don't create the harmful content. And in the US and in the legislative change in Australia in the last week, what you're seeing, in a sense, the courts and the government do is say, actually, you are responsible for the harm that your algorithmic recommendation systems cause. And that's a significant shift here because it's kind of saying, look, yes, the content can be harmful, but if you amplify that harm by using algorithmic recommendation, then you have a specific responsibility for that. And I think that's where you're going to see both, legal and regulatory emphasis and attention over the coming years. And I think this is why these shifts are so significant, because it's the first time, in a sense, that platforms are being held directly responsible for this, algorithmic harm that they cause.
Thank you, Nicholas, for sharing your insights with us. We were speaking to Nicholas Cara, Director for the Center of Digital Cultures and Societies at the University of Queensland.